Okay, so we are in the sixth and final lesson. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday evening, changing the schedule. And we are going to be discussing the truth of Sinai. So, what do we discuss this course, and how does this class come into the picture? So, essentially, everything that we've discussed this entire course hinges upon the truth of Sinai. We spoke about the oral Torah, the oral tradition, various facets of the oral tradition, both what God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai, as well as the 13 principles that God gave to Moses to derive from the Torah, and then the power that, again, God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai to the prophets and the leaders to legislate, as well as the idea of customs. All of the above is from Mount Sinai, and then becomes the question: is there rational evidence for the occurrence of Mount Sinai, for God giving us the Torah? Um, so what I'm going to do is on page 187. Well, without page 187, you could just skip that. I'll do a show of hands. So if you could show me from 1 to 4 fingers, how important is it for you to have evidence of the historical history of Mount Sinai, that Mount Sinai happened? From one being very not important and four being very important. Just from a show of fingers, if you could show me how important is it to you that you have historical evidence for such an event? Right. Okay, we have all different types of answers over here. Very good. Okay. Um, so let's talk about some of the people that might not be interested in such a conversation, not interested in evidence. So obviously there is the atheist, the non-believer, and he says, well, if there's no God, then obviously Sinai didn't happen. It's simply a waste of time. Um, so obviously the premise of our conversation is that there is a God. We believe in a God, and based on that conversation, based on that premise, we are having this conversation. The conversation of is there a God is beyond the scope of our class, of our lesson, and perhaps we could have that conversation after this lesson. Okay, then there is people that say, well, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to hear that Mount Sinai is definitively true, because some people have a hard time with knowing the truth and not living by it. So if I'm going to be proven that Mount Sinai happened, then that would cause an issue for my actual, daily life, and I'm not ready to do that. So to that, I would say that Torah tells us, as you know very well, that we take one step at a time, like the menorah on Hanukkah. We light one candle at a time, and every night we grow one, two, three, etc. In Judaism, we're not supposed to jump. God doesn't say take it all on. God says take it at your pace. As long as we're growing, doing one step at a time, we're headed in the right direction. Okay, then there is the major believer, someone that says, "Well, I believe I don't need any proof. Why do I care to be proven that Mount Sinai happened?" And the answer to that person is that belief is great, but then God also gave us a mind, gave us a brain, and the purpose of that mind is to engage Judaism with that mind as well. And therefore, it is incumbent upon us to be engaged with God in every facet of our life, including our minds. Okay, and then finally, there is the person that's not truth seeking, but they're beauty seeking. So their relationship with Judaism is simply because it's nice, it's beautiful, it's inspirational, and whether Judaism is the truth or not is not necessarily part of the equation. And obviously the danger to that is, well, will that stand the test of time? When they find something else which perhaps is more beautiful, will they revert to that and leave Judaism behind? So I think everyone will gain from this conversation, which is essentially going to be, could we prove to one extent or another that Judaism is true? Um, okay, so to begin, we're going to read a letter, and this letter you're going to find on page 187, text number 1. The history to this letter, the story behind this letter, is that in the 12th century, there was a Muslim ruler that was forcing the Yemenite Jews to convert. And ultimately, there was one Jew that converted to Islam, and that Jew made it very difficult for the rest of the Jews, speaking out very loudly and creating issues, as well as another Jew that got up at that time, taking advantage of the chaos and claiming to be the Messiah, and he was, of course, a false Messiah. And at the time, the Rambam Maimonides wrote a letter um, talking about the history of anti-Semitism, the history of Christianity and Islam, and addressing the concept of a false Messiah and urging the Jews to be firm in their belief. So join me on page 187, text number 1, and this is how he finishes off his letter. Linda, if you could read for us.
Surely. Remember, my co-religionists, that this great, incomparable, and unique historical event is attested to by the best of evidence, for never before or since has a whole nation witnessed a revelation from God or beheld his splendor.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much, Linda. So the question is, Maimonides is known to be a well-known rationalist. And what compelled Maimonides to make such a statement that that our religion is a religion with uncomparable historical evidence? What compelled Maimonides to believe in the story of Sinai as a rationalist? And in fact, I don't think it was just Maimonides that believed that or trusted that, but our grandparents, going back, tens of generations, all held this belief to the point of dying for this belief. And we're talking about Jews who are considered to be smart people. And the question that we're going to begin today with is, on what basis did all of our ancestors buy into the Sinai narrative? Okay, so to begin, we're going to analyze the concept of evidence. So, what are the standards for evidence? So, I'm going to ask you to turn to page 188. And we have a exercise here, exercise number 2. And I'm going to ask you to mark down for yourself when it comes to evidence. Someone came into the room and told you that they saw, they heard that America invaded Iran or whatever it is. What would be the standards of evidence that you would require to believe them? We have A, any measure of evidence. B, evidence that proves that the event is more likely true than false. C, evidence that meets the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. D, evidence that meets the standard of beyond a shadow of a doubt. And then E would be other. So if you could just take a moment for yourself and think about, in every other area of your life, what is your standard of evidence? Okay, so
I
yes, BA, welcome. Good to see you.
sorry. So was that rhetorical or do you want our answer?
You could give an answer, sure.
Um, I'd love to be able to tell you that my standard is so high that it's always, D. But the reality that I live in when I think about even my everyday experience is that I don't live in a world where I can have the authority to demand that kind of evidence from other people around me. I have to decide what I trust and what I don't trust. And so I would say that I'm between B and C because I know I'm surrounded by a lot of smart people who ask really tough questions and really good questions every day, and they're challenged by the facts in front of us every day in the hardest way that Hashem could challenge us. And so if we still collectively are on the same page and we see those evidences, even though they're not beyond the shadow of a doubt, it still seems that somewhere between B and C is where my reality lives,
Okay,
not where
very
mom says we should go.
great.
Yeah,
So
it's C. I agree.
what?
I agree with BA. I went with C as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So generally, when it comes to conversations about religion, is there a God? Is the Torah true? People tend to look for number D, beyond the shadow of a doubt. Give me evidence that's unbreakable, that is completely foolproof. And the issue is that what we forget is that in day-to-day life, in regular scenarios, we don't do that. We don't look for that sort of evidence. If you were looking for that sort of evidence, you wouldn't be able to trust anything. There are people that say that even what you see is an illusion. So you wouldn't even be able to trust your own sight, let alone what someone else told you, no matter who was telling it to you. So in life, we work on probability. We're all sitting in our homes right now, and none of us are wearing a hard hat in case the roof is going to cave in. Although there is a possibility that the roof will cave in because we go by probability. So there is no foolproof evidence that that's not going to happen. There's actually a very scary, little bit of a spooky story with Emmanuel Shochat, Rabbi Emmanuel Shochat. He used to debate many priests and ministers um, about the Jewish religion versus Christianity. You could look him up. He's a well-known figure. And at one point, he was making this point, saying that we don't look for full proof. And he mentioned this concept that no one here is wearing a hard hat because they were sitting in some sort of, stadium or hall that's been around for a long time. And shortly after the event, that hall actually caved in, which was a little bit of a spooky
Mm.
experience. In any case, there is obviously a possibility that such a thing will happen, but we as human beings work on probability. And if I'm able to be shown that most probably this is the case, then I will go with the probability and I will not look after the minutest chance of otherwise. Okay, on the flip side, we don't go with flimsy evidence. I wouldn't just take any little schnook that's telling me something that's wacky. It has to be something believable. It has to be something that makes sense. It has to be something that's within my realm. And if it's something wacky, I need stronger evidence to believe that. So kind of, if we're going to break it down, I think this is what BA mentioned as well as Lisa. If we look at our list in front of us, so there's the A, B, C, and D. So I think the D, which is saying this is impossible, is pretty much out. Um, the A, which is insufficient evidence, is pretty much out. And we're left with B and C somewhere in the middle. Either evidence that says more likely true than false or beyond a reasonable doubt. And indeed, in our civil system, in our courts today, so if it's a civil case, they usually would go with a B, and in a criminal case, they would go with C. in a civil case, you would want to prove that the defendant is more likely guilty than not, and in a criminal case, you would want to prove that the defendant is is uh, is is the culprit beyond a reasonable doubt. But again, we do not look for foolproof evidence. So
Actually, I want to double confirm our penal system, our legal system in the US, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not to the D, it's C, right?
correct. No, so in the criminal system, it's a C, and in the civil case, it would be a B. That's my
Oh,
understanding.
interesting. Okay, great. Thank you.
But yeah, definitely not a D. Definitely not a D. So as we continue our conversation, I will allow you to decide at the end of our class whether our conversation falls into the B category or the C category. I believe it will fall into one or the other. Okay. So to begin our conversation, the question is going to be, so what is the narrative that we are believing in, right? So we are going to be going back to the scripture, going back to the Bible, and you would say, well, if we're going to read it from the Bible, then that's kind of tripping ourselves up. There's no point in that. We're trying to prove the validity of the Bible. But over here, the question is, okay, so what are we believing in? What does the Bible say? And the question is, are we, could we prove that or not? So join me on page 191, text number 2. And what I'm going to do is, so page 191, text number 2, and I'm going to read it inside. We're going to be reading text number 2A, 2B, and 2C. And these are 3 different texts from the Bible which talk about the revelation at Mount Sinai. And I want you to grab your pen. And as I read through these texts, I'm going to ask you to underline and make a number as to any word or phrase that indicates that Sinai was a public event versus a private event, meaning Sinai was all the Jewish people seeing or hearing God, and not just one person, let's say Moses, hearing or seeing God. So here we go. And by the end, when I'm done reading, I'm going to ask you how many accounts, how many times throughout these verses does it seem to be saying that it was all the people hearing or seeing God. So in the 3rd month of the children of Israel's departure from Egypt, on this day they arrived in the desert of Sinai. They journeyed from Rephidim and they arrived in the desert of Sinai, and they encamped in the desert. And Israel encamped there opposite the mountain. God said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in the thickness of the cloud, in order the people hear when I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever. God said to Moses, go to the people and prepare them today and tomorrow, and they shall wash their garments. They shall be prepared for the 3rd day, for on the 3rd day God will descend before the eyes of all the people upon Mount Sinai. It came to pass on the 3rd day, when it was morning, that there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud was upon the mountain, and a very powerful blast of a shofar, and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. Moses brought the people out toward God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. God spoke all of these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. All the people saw the voices and the torches, the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain. The people saw and trembled, and they stood from afar. They said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear, but let God not speak with us, lest we die. The people remained far off, and Moses drew near to the
Opaque.
opaque darkness where God was. God said to Moses, so shall you say to the children of Israel, you have seen that from the heavens, and I have spoken with you. Moving on to text 2b. But beware and watch yourself very well, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, and lest these things depart from your heart all the days of your life. So this is Deuteronomy where Moses is speaking to the Jewish people. Be sure to make them known to your children, to your children's children. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Chereb, when God said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words, and they may learn to revere me all the days that we live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. You approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire up to the midst of the heavens, with darkness, a cloud and opaque darkness. God spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no image, just a voice. He told you his covenant, which he commanded you to do, the 10 Commandments, and he inscribed them on 2 stone tablets. Did ever a people hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard and live? You have been shown in order to know that the Lord is God. There is none else besides him. From the heavens he let you hear his voice to instruct you, and upon the earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. Continuing Deuteronomy 2c. Face to face, God spoke with you at the mountain out of the midst of the fire. God spoke these words to your entire assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud and the opaque darkness, with a great voice which did not cease. And he inscribed them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. When you heard the voice in the midst of the darkness and the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. You said, behold, God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we heard his voice in the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks with man, yet man remains alive. So now, why should we live? For this great fire will consume us. We will die if we continue to hear the voice of God. For who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived? Okay, any numbers? Does anyone have a number for me?
1, 2, 3, 4. One.
A lot. I lost track.
God said, behold, I will come. That's 1. God said to Moses, go to, no. God will descend before the eyes. No. God spoke, saying, I am the Lord your God. It's 1. All the people saw. That's 2. People saw and trembled. 3.
Anyone? No one counted along the way?
What about 18?
18. Okay, that's enough for me. Okay, so yeah, there's roughly 18, 20, 25, whatever, depending on what you're going to count or you're not going to count. But the point is that it's very clear from the Bible that the claim is, the narrative is, that all the Jewish people saw God. Now, how many people is that? How many Jewish people were standing at the foot of the mountain? So we know that there were 600,000 families at Mount Sinai. 600,000 families. So if we're going to make a quick estimated total, we have 600,000 adults, males, 600,000 adult females. We're holding at 1.2 million. And then if we're going to give 3 children per family, we're holding at an estimated total of 3 million people. You know, give or take, maybe it's 2 million, maybe it's 4 million. Let's assume that there were 3 million people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. So the question is, if we're going to assume that the narrative is false, if we're going to assume that it's a lie, someone made it up along the way, then the question is, how and when did this lie develop? How did a lie develop that 3 million people saw God at the foot of Mount Sinai? Okay, so let's break it down. What are the various theories that could possibly exist for when this lie developed? Generally, there are 2 theories for when this lie could have developed. One is called the present theory, and the other one's called the past theory. Okay, so let's talk about these 2 theories. What's the present theory? The present theory is that there's a guy named Moses, and he's a
And it's
very,
his birthday today, or it was his
yes,
birthday
today was
today.
his birthday.
Yeah.
And he's a very pragmatic guy, very convincing, very talented individual. And he comes down from the mountain or at any point, and he turns to these 3 million people that are in front of him and he says, listen, you all just saw God. Right? So that would be the present theory. How could have such a story been made up? Moses came down from the mountain or whatever point, and he turns to 3 million people and he says, listen up. You all saw God. Let's write it down and let's tell this to our children, and they will tell it to their children, etc. That would be the present theory. What's the past theory? The past theory is that there's a guy trying to remember the name that they used for him. So let me just give me a second. Hmm. Okay, so there's a guy by the name of Fred. So this is the past theory. There's a guy by the name of Fred, and Fred shows up one day and he turns to the Jewish people. He's a Jew, and he turns to the other Jewish people around him and he says, guys, a few thousand years ago, there was a man named Moses. And that Moses took the Jewish people out of Egypt, which is our ancestors, and they went to the desert, and then God revealed himself to the 3 million people. And ultimately, because of exiles, because of whatever, this story got lost. But I've been holding on to this. Either I had a dream of some sort, or it's been a secret in the family for ages. And now I'm coming and telling you all that this is your story. This is the story of your ancestors. And now let's go write it in a book. This story that happened a few thousand years ago. Right? So we have the present theory and the past theory. Present theory, Moses made it up. Past theory, Fred made it up. Okay, now I'm going to do a similar exercise to what I did before, and I'm going to ask you from numbers 1 to 5, if you could show me with your fingers whether you think that the present theory is believable and whether you think the past theory is believable. So I'm going to start with the present theory, the theory that there was a man named Moses, and he kind of showed up and made it up and told us that you guys have just seen God. From 1 to 5, 1 being very not believable, 5 being very believable, what credit would you give the present theory?
Present theory. With my hands. Oh, that's present theory.
Anyone else want to give us their hands?
What is it?
Not
How many fingers
believable.
should we hold up?
One
So
is not
1 being
believable.
very not
Oh,
believable,
yeah.
and 5 being very believable.
Okay.
Okay, so anyone that held up 1 finger, I saw Judy and Adi. Do you want to tell us why you think that this is not believable? What's the flaw in this theory? Where's the hole?
Wait, so someone is telling me that Moses said that I saw God. That's the theory?
Yes.
Well, I know what I saw. I don't need someone else to tell me what I saw. If I didn't see it, then I know I didn't see it, for myself at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with
Anyone
you.
that held up 3 or more fingers, do you want to counter argument that? Do you have a thought process that you want to maybe challenge that?
Well, the premise on both premises. Who was what is there to actually? I mean, because it's so far in history, there could be nothing to test as testimony. So the wars we fought and things that we fought in our history, there were books written about it. There were people that have lived it are no longer alive anymore. So history is based on a lot of premise because it's things that none of us have experienced. We're reading about the Civil War, this war, that war, and we built our society on all of this history. So the thing that's so uncomfortable about, I think, the Bible is so many years have passed in history that, it's almost, there's always that skepticism about, or compartmentalize it into a word that we call spiritual belief, where we can't necessarily prove it. I mean,
Belinda, I believe
it
I believe you're addressing the past theory, right? So over here we're talking about present theory. So past theory would be that someone currently is telling me that something happened in the past. But present theory would be that there was a point in time that
right.
presently someone showed up and said, "You just saw God." Not telling me a history story, but telling me something that happened presently. And on that, Judy says, "Well, you can't tell me what I saw. I know what I saw. Who
Right.
in their right mind would believe that they saw something that they did not see, let alone seeing God?"
Correct.
I'm just
Okay.
gonna say,
Oh,
I'm choking on my cold. Sorry, it's almost over, but not quite there. So I think your father leads in this area. Like your father gives us these stories or brings even like our local community family whose Torah was passed, oddly, from a great great grandfather who wrote the Torah to the child who received it, like what, 10 years ago or something. We just learned about that 10, 15 years ago. And just through some commerce and other interesting activities. When those stories are told to me, I am continuously reminded that it doesn't have to be something as overt as written proof. It has to be the continuous affirmation from all different angles. And you put it together and say, how much of that? It's like if I were a professor or someone doing research, my paper that I produce has no value until someone cites it, and the next person cites it, and the next person cites it. And that gives it the social credit or the weight. And I feel like that's the same way with these things. When I hear in the present theory, and if I'm taking this the wrong way, please correct me, each story one after the other, I say, my gosh, is this not adding up to something incredible?
No,
Am
but
I thinking the wrong way?
yeah. In terms of validating or proving the truth of Judaism, there's many avenues we could take. There's obviously the avenue of, well, look at the Jewish people that are still around. That itself is a miracle. And there's no, so many empires have come and gone, and we're still here to tell the tale. And that for some people would be sufficient proof. Then you could look at the Bible itself and you could see the perfectionism of the Bible. Some people will point to the fact that the Bible is the only book that criticizes the writers, the quote unquote writers of the book, meaning if the Jewish people made this story up, then we wouldn't be criticizing ourselves. And the Bible constantly criticizes the Jewish people. Okay, so many people have various different avenues of taking this, including BA, what you just said. But over here, what we're going to is to the original narrative of the giving of the Torah, Mount Sinai. God revealed himself to the Jewish people. And the question is, when was that story made up? Who made up that story and when did they make it up? And present theory would suggest that Moses made it up. So how did Moses get 3 million people to believe it? I guess, he had to be very pragmatic, very, very outgoing, and he convinced 3 million people that this story was true. But what was the story that he told them? That they saw God, right? So going back, would you believe that if someone showed up to you and said that they just saw, sorry, not that they saw, that you just saw, whatever, we'll get to that in a second. So we'll get back to present theory soon. Okay, now moving on to past theory. So past theory would be that Jeff, is that who we're talking about? No.
Fred. Fred.
Fred. So Fred shows up at some point of history and tells us that, you guys are all living your own lives, But by the way, you should know that there's something called the Jewish people, and God took us out of Egypt, and there's a Moses, and there used to be a temple, depending on when Fred came in history. But Fred basically made up all of that history and kind of got us onto the boat from there, telling us that our ancestors, 3 million of them at the time, have experienced this experience, and we simply all forgot it from our history, and now Fred is here to bring it back to the fold. So numbers 1 to 5, if you could show me with your fingers, do you believe that theory has valid ground? 1 being that it's very holy, meaning it's not valid, and 5 being that it's a strong theory. Okay, so someone that's holding up their 1, do you want to tell us why it's not a strong theory? Why is the past theory not a strong theory?
Because it's all hearsay. It's not,
Correct.
that's all hearsay. There's no like,
But every religion is based on hearsay, right? So every other religion, which religion is pretty popular these days, every other religion, Christianity, Islam, are all based on one man, on a Fred of sorts, coming and telling us a story, and people buying into that story. Why isn't that the Jewish story?
Because the Jews are living it. We've brought traditions into our lives.
Well, every religion has tradition, I would venture to say.
well, because it's written in the Torah.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk about this.
All right.
I'm going to address each one of these theories separately, and then we'll hear what people have to say. So, what is the shortcoming of the present theory? And I think Judy said very well. You could convince your neighbor that you visited Alaska last year by giving enough details to make your story sound believable. But try to convince your neighbor that you both visited Alaska together last year.
Right.
That would obviously be problematic. And in this case, if we are going to try to see how Judaism is comparable to other religions, we could see how every other religion started with I had a vision. Every other religion started with an I, a singular person, one man coming forward and saying, I had an experience. Why isn't it that we have stories of religions that people came forward and said, you all saw this vision? And I think a very simple reason why that never happened is because no one would buy it. Right? So if one person wants to come forward and say a lie, they want to make it as believable as possible. And to claim that everyone saw it is very non-believable. To say I saw it is much more believable. You follow me? So all sightseeings of two-headed aliens coming out of some sort of machine never happened at the Yankee Stadium when it was full of people. Then it simply never happened. Why? Because for one person to come and make a claim is much more believable than for many people to be told by that one person, you all saw this. So Torah is telling us you saw it. The present theory, Moses is telling 3 million people you saw it. How would that pass? How would that ever fly? David, you have a question?
It's not so much a question. To my knowledge, Judaism is the only religion that is based on a common perception of the event of the revelation. People heard what Jesus said and chose to believe him. People heard what Muhammad said, chose to believe him. But in this case, in Judaism, it was a mass revelation. And it's not just Moses telling people, everyone who was there
There you go.
saw it and told. And I have strong questions about the validity of oral Torah and so much of tradition, and particularly rabbinic Judaism, no offense. But you can't disregard how it started. And it's the only one with that kind of a beginning.
There you go. There
What do
you
you
go.
mean by that?
That there was a mass revelation,
Oh,
that
okay.
there were 3 million people,
Majority,
Right.
plus a lot of non-Jews that left Egypt with the Jews. So the number was inflated even further, and everyone saw what happened
Corroborated even further.
Right.
and went on with their lives telling the
Beautiful.
story of what they saw.
BA, you had a question? Or that
A
was a
little
question?
more of a comment. I think, to what you were saying earlier, hopefully it's still relevant, that whether I see something or we see something, I'm continuously in a position to change a culture, a mindset, and that is similar in a much smaller scale. But I think it's a combination that's most powerful. So Moses saying, "This is what I saw, and this is what you saw." So I'm telling you how to interpret what you just experienced. And it connects you to the powerful thing that I experienced. And then therefore we all experience it. So I feel like there's a way that, although he was the less articulate one, the one with the stutter, the one who a little more awkward, his brain did worked fine. It was how it came out that was the issue. And he knew it was his experience and then making sure that the other people felt connected to that they saw some of it too, that would make the final link for everyone to feel like they had that same experience.
I hear you. So you're challenging this theory.
Yeah.
You're challenging this theory, which is fine. I don't want to respond now because
Oh, you don't,
the
all good.
response is going to
Thank
be
you.
later. What?
No, all good, all good. I just like that we all get our ideas out. I don't need a response. I just think it's fun that we all get to participate. Thank you.
So no, that's definitely a good point. And of course, like I mentioned, there's always going to be holes in any idea, which kind of brings us back to our initial conversation, which is we don't look in general in life, we don't look for absolute proof. We look for probability. And then the question is going to be for BA, so then what's the probability of that being the story? Okay, regardless, let's move on. So that's regarding the past theory, the present theory. Now, visiting the past theory, what would be the shortcomings for the past theory? What is the past theory? That, again, you're gonna have to help me, Fred. Is that
Right.
it?
That's it.
Fred shows up and tells us that a number of years ago, your ancestors stood on Mount Sinai and they accepted the Torah and they saw God. Now, the first problem with this, I believe, is well, why didn't we know about this? If Fred were to show up to me and tell me, listen up, but there's these whole set of rules, 613 rules that you got to start listening to because your ancestors stood on Mount Sinai and they saw God, I would say, well, why didn't my dad tell me about this? Why didn't my grandfather tell me about this? What happened to this link of history? Why do you know about this and not I? So I think that's a basic issue with the past theory. But a much greater issue with the past theory, a much bigger problem with the past theory is if I were to ask you who were the most famous Jewish personalities, could we name, the top four most famous personalities in Jewish history, in our history,
Jason,
Joan Rivers.
in Jewish history, as in the history of the Jewish
Weitzman.
people.
Abraham, Isaac, Yitzhak,
You mean
right?
not
So
these two twins who just made NFL hockey history and the female
so
goalie
someone, so
also?
someone,
We have a female goalie who just got a gold
so
medal. Come
someone
on,
told me
that's
that there's, if you watch that course that I sent you guys, so he makes the point. He says that there are a lot of Jewish writers, a lot of Jewish authors, but there aren't that many authors of Judaism, right? So there's a difference between Jewish authors that are writing about math and science and fiction, and then there is authors of Jewish content. So I'm not asking about Jewish people that are famous, I'm asking about famous Jews in Jewish history.
Rashi and Maimonides.
Right. So if you talk about the fact, you know, Moses definitely is one of the most famous ones. Abraham is probably one of the four famous ones. And we have a number of other names that were brought out. But one name that was not mentioned was Fred. Now, if Fred is the one responsible for our tradition, if we know about Judaism because of Fred, I would think he would be a pretty big hero
Mhm.
in our tradition.
Jerry Seinfeld.
He
Jerry
does-
Seinfeld, but Jerry Seinfeld doesn't claim to
He's a contemporary.
he doesn't claim to have introduced Judaism, right? So you
But he's an advocate.
you know, Lahavdil, you talk about Christianity, you have Jesus, and then you have Paul, and Paul introduced Jesus to the world. He's definitely a big name out there. If Fred is responsible for introducing Judaism to the world, then I would think Fred would be somewhere in that history. And the fact that Fred is not in the history proves to me, without a shadow of a doubt, that Fred never existed. BA, you have a question.
it's not a question. I never really knew that much about the Rebbe, and I understood maybe this much about Lubavitch. When my kids were growing up and we're engaged in things. It just the whole thing didn't come together for me until a few years ago in that regard. I grew up in I think what we'd all call a regular secular experience. My kids went to Jewish day school. We were a little more than secular, but we were still very secular. And I think now that I've gone through at least last year and a half of a little more awareness in these things. I can't relate to Moses. I can't barely relate to Noah, but Noah's probably the closest that I relate to. Like, the world is sinking and let's go save something, you know? I feel like that's something I can relate to. But the Rebbe, and I don't believe the Rebbe's a conduit to Hashem, but he's absolutely someone who hears and knows and interacts and guides and has definitely a special ear and something. The more I learn about what he said and what he did and how he interacted with people, I'm a huge fan. I feel like that's someone I would have connected with, and really appreciated having time and space together if I could ever have that. But it's harder for me to relate to the older souls. It's like the women are a little easier, but it's still hard because they lived under conditions that were still so different for us. But their heart and soul, we definitely connect to. So I'll say today, it's the famous Jewish personalities for me has more recently become the Rebbe because I can most relate to him
Okay,
as he
fair enough.
given us these.
But be it as it may, we still didn't find Fred in the picture.
I have no idea where you got the name Fred. Is Fred like English for a Jewish name? Like, what is Fred?
No, the
Like,
point is that
Just the
there's a
person.
personality out there. You know, the past theory is that there's a personality out there that made up the story and convinced all of us
Right.
Fred makes
of
up
the
the
story
story.
about Moses, right? So where we called the guy, we named the guy Fred because we don't have someone like that in our history. And to add to that, if you go back to the very first lesson, I believe, in the extras over there in the appendix, there was a whole map, a very impressive map of our history from teacher to student to teacher to student to teacher to student, going down till the creation of the Talmud, and that continued. You know, till today. Every
Where
one of
Joanne
them.
found her ancestor, didn't Joanne map herself to that?
Yes, yes, yes. So every single one of us really could map ourselves to that. And every single one of us could say that, who was my teacher? X. And who was his teacher? X. And I couldn't go back to Moses, starting from my teacher. So to make the claim that there was a time in history that we forgot about Judaism and Fred came and reminded us about it, would be, I think, absolutely ridiculous. Okay.
I
So
think
we
what you're saying disregards the fact that there wasn't one point of light. There were 3 million people spreading the story out, and the teachers and the Rebbe and the Rebbes before him may have been looked to for the purpose of keeping the tradition that came from Moses, that came from Sinai. But that's, from my perspective, not Judaism. From
Okay, so
my
David,
perspective,
you're going back to, right. You're going back to a
it's
conversation where I think beyond the
it's a
beyond the
belief
scope.
of it's to open your eyes and look at the sky and look at the trees and the snow and life, and then apply that to the values that we've been taught, again, that were spread out with this incredible web that started with 3 million people, not one person.
Right.
Moses was the center of it,
So
but it didn't come from him.
So going back to, I'm going. I think you're asking a heavy question. I think this is a question that you've been constantly saying one way or another. Um, Not so much of a question, or as much as more of a perspective. I think it's beyond the scope of our conversation, but suffice it to say, I'll address that for a moment. That if you look at our history, I think it, that perspective is a little bit discounting what our history actually was. For someone to make the claim that for all of history, the Jewish people have had, different ways of serving God and various thousands of ways of addressing and implementing Torah's values, is simply not true. For all of our history, up to the very recent history, the vast majority of Jews have kept one mainstream Judaism, all claiming to have had the same revelation at Mount Sinai, and therefore all conforming to the rabbinic Judaism. And throughout history, at any point that there were parties, there always were these groups of people that kind of went off and made their own fragmented aspects of Judaism, they've all ceased to exist. None of them exist anymore. There's always been new ones that have crept up. But the Karaites and the Sadducees, they don't exist anymore for good reason, because that is simply not what we've been told by our ancestors. So again, I know you feel very strongly about this. I don't want to go into a long debate about this right now, but just suffice to say, for the moment, that I think that it would be a misinterpretation of history to say that that is the history of the Jewish people.
Right, I'm talking about the contemporary perspective, contemporary being the last several centuries.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So moving right along. So we dealt with the present theory, we dealt with the past theory, and what we're left with is what's called the snowball theory. And the snowball theory is when one person has a personal vision, let's say it was Moses or perhaps Fred, and that narrative eventually changes over time, that people start saying that there was this mass revelation. So Moses came down from the mountain and he told 3 million people, I saw God. Fast forward 3,000 years later, and somehow that narrative changed to, oh, all the people saw God, and now let's go write that into the Bible. So according to the snowball theory, the Bible was only written after that change happened, many, many years after the original vision happened. Okay, this sounds like a pretty convincing theory. Different, definitely different than the previous ones. But obviously the question on this theory would be, well, when did this great shift happen? That's not just that's not one person to 10 people to 20 people. To say that one person saw God and then 3 million people saw God, at what point did that shift happen? And at that point, why didn't people question it? Why didn't people say, well, what are you talking about? When did that ever happen? Why didn't my dad tell me that? Okay. I think the point that we take out of all this conversation, which goes back to what David said earlier tonight, is that Judaism's claim is unique. The fact is that Judaism's claim that all 3 million people saw God, there was a mass revelation, is unique compared to any other religion. And what is so powerful about that? And I'll tell you what's so powerful about that. What's so powerful about that is that we know when it comes to science that anything natural must be replicable, right? So anything, history repeats itself. Anything that happened naturally is bound to happen again. If something happened once and it never happens again, science will say that's not natural. What are the chances of it happening once and never happening again? That was an unnatural occurrence. Because if it was a natural occurrence, if it's possible to happen, if it's a possibility, it will happen again. And if you talk about the history of any other religion, you talk about Christianity, you talk about Islam, you talk about Buddhism, they're all based on the same principle, which is that there was a vision that one person had and convinced many others. So the possibility of that being a natural occurrence, meaning God not involved in that story, is a possibility because it continuously happened and continues to happen. Now, if the story of Mount Sinai was a natural event, meaning the fact that there are millions of Jews alive today that claim that their ancestors, 3 million of them, saw God on Mount Sinai, if that was a natural occurrence, a natural event, I don't care how you're going to slice it. I don't care what your explanation will be. That should happen again. Why has it never happened again? Why has history never repeated itself? Why does Judaism have a unique story, a unique narrative? And I think but the bottom line that you would come to, if you think about it from an honest perspective, is that because it was an unnatural occurrence. It wasn't a natural event. Going back to BA, BA said about the present theory that, perhaps the Jewish people experienced something and Moses kind of convinced them, or maybe you could say that they were on shrooms, or someone wants to once claim that if Abraham was gonna sacrifice his son and Isaac was gonna go along with it, they must have both been deranged. And chances are Jacob was also deranged, and the 12 tribes were deranged. So when you talk about 3 million people standing outside, they must have all been deranged. So they all thought that they saw something and they never actually saw it. You could go and say things from today to tomorrow. So besides the fact that I don't think that the children of 3 million deranged people would be 57% of the Nobel Prize winners of the world. But besides for that, if that were the case, then history is bound to repeat itself. Then that story should have happened again. We should have had another story of 3 million deranged people experiencing God. That never happened again. Okay, so that I think is the big proof over here, or what Rabbi Lawrence Kelman likes to call the bomb, for the validity of the story of Sinai, for the narrative of Sinai. What I want to do now is show you a short clip from Rabbi Lawrence Kelman. He is a rabbi who is a Baal Tshuva. He came from a non-religious background. He grew up with no Judaism at all, and he discovered Judaism when he was in college, and he was trying to debunk all religions, including Judaism. And he created a theory to basically debunk all religions. And ultimately, he came to Judaism, and he was convinced by the validity of Judaism, and he became a religious Jew. And essentially, most of what we spoke about today is from him, and he says it much more eloquently than me. So I will send you the link to one of his talks. He's quite entertaining. But here's a small clip, where he addresses the problem with this argument that we are currently making. To remind you, the current argument is that if Mount Sinai was a natural event, the fact that we believe in Mount Sinai today was a natural event, then it should have happened again. History were to repeat itself. And the fact that it didn't repeat itself tells us that it's not natural. And when he's giving the talk, he mentions the following story, which kind of poses an issue to this idea. Here you go.
World in the last 15 years, mainly at universities, most often to academics. I've never heard a counter-argument, although I would love to hear one. In a lecture now it's going back about 7 years ago, I mentioned in the lecture that I felt there were holes in my qualifications to give this lecture because although I've traveled in many countries, I've never had the opportunity to visit India, and the oldest pagan group on the planet happens to be in India. I believe that the oldest religion, continuous religion on the planet today is a Hindu group in India. I'll tell you the name, but don't jump to conclusions. It's not the group you're thinking of. They're called the Hare Krishnas. And it's not the Hare Krishnas that you know of. The Hare Krishnas here in America are fakers. They're monotheists. They messed up the whole system. The original Hare Krishnas in India, they're polytheists, the original polytheists. They were probably the same sort of religion that Abraham was watching when he was growing up. Once after a lecture, a fellow came up to me in Jerusalem, and he said to me, "Did you know that Hare Krishna has opened an outreach center in Tel Aviv?" I said, "It's not possible. They don't do this sort of outreach, and they would never come to Israel. It's got to be the American Hare Krishnas." She said, "No, it's the original guys from India. I know it's the original guys from India." So I checked it out. I ended up meeting with basically the director of outreach for their group. And sure enough, they were the original Hare Krishna from India. And the guy's name, I can't tell you his name for reasons you'll understand in a minute, but the guy's name sounded like Shrewdlou Goldberg. So, no, he was not a Baal Tshuva of sorts, yes? He was actually a from birth Hare Krishna. His parents grew up in New York. Like any intelligent person looking for spirituality in New York, they went to India. They there discovered Hare Krishna, and they became Hare Krishnas, and there they gave birth to Shrewdlou, who grew up a from birth Hare Krishna. When they needed to send a team to do outreach in Israel, they picked Shrewdlou Goldberg to be the man. So he came, and I'm sitting with him. I said, "Shrewdlou, let's cut to the chase. I just want to know, what's your revelation narrative?" Shrewdlou says to me, "Oh no, Mr. Kellerman, that's not how we do things." Okay, so I had to adjust a little bit. I said, "Okay, Shrewdlou, how do we do things?" Shrewdlou says to me, "Here we share." He says, "Mr. Kellerman, first you tell me your revelation narrative." It's like, this is unbelievable. Shrewdlou Goldberg wants to hear the Jewish revelation narrative. I just loaded my rifle and fired with both barrels, you know. The poor guy, for an hour, I told him the entire lecture that I've told you. I didn't mean to come to, drag some Jew back to his heritage, but what can I do? God brought me here, The man is calmly listening to me. He doesn't seem, moved at all by anything that I'm saying. At the end of an hour, I said, "So don't you see, Shrewdlou, Judaism is true. Your religion is true." So Shrewdlou looks at me and says, "Mr. Kellerman, while it might be true that your religion is true, our religion, Hare Krishna is also true. I exploded. I said, Shrilu, you can't know that yours is true. Ours you can know. Shrilu says, no, we can also know that our religion is true. I said, how? He says, we also have a mass revelation. And what bothered me was the man was so sincere. And I said to him, what are you talking about? And he says, haven't you ever read the Bhagavad Gita? And I said, you're darn right I've read the Bhagavad Gita. It's a famous Hindu tract. It's about a battle between two peoples. He says, Mr. Kellerman, at the battle of the Bhagavad Gita, how many people were present? There were 3 million. He says, yes, Mr. Kellerman, and we have an oral tradition that at the battle of the Bhagavad Gita, our chief god, Krishna, descended in the sight of all 3 million people. He spoke to them and all 3 million people dropped dead just like your people at Sinai. So I turned white. I didn't know what to say. You know, I was trying to picture, how am I going to look in a toga? You know, and I told him the whole thing about God spoke to us, we dropped dead, we got back up again, the angels revived us, he spoke to us again, we dropped dead, we said, please, Moshe, you get the Torah. I said to him, like, let's go over this again. God spoke to them, they all dropped dead, what happened next? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, God spoke to them, they all dropped dead, what happened next? He said, well, they laid there. I said, well, they didn't get back up again? He says, no. So I said, they were all dead? He said, yeah. So I said, then how do you know the story? So he says, well, many, many years later, that God came to one guy, told him, and then he told everybody else. I want to close with a...
Okay. In any case, that was funny. Hope you found the humor in there. Okay, so we will close with, where am I? Why is this not working for me? Okay, so let's see this point that we're making here, this concept that you know, the Judaism's validity is because we all saw God. It was a mass visual which never existed and never will never exist in any other religion. This is actually stated in Deuteronomy, in the Torah itself. And here you see the verse on the screen, and it reads that every people hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and lived. Did ever a people claim to hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and lived? So God essentially is telling us that never in history was there, never in history will there be another group to come out and to make the claim that we have made, that that Judaism is real, that Torah is real. Ultimately, to appreciate the authenticity of Torah, to appreciate this conversation, we must find meaning in Torah. If we don't find meaning in Torah, then not necessarily will we appreciate these arguments. And I think that's upon us to find that meaning. I want to finish off with a letter from the Rebbe. Amongst many letters, this is one letter that the Rebbe writes about this concept. The Rebbe basically sums up our conversation on page 207, text number 9. And I'm going to ask Ron if you could read for us. 207, text number 9, and this is a letter that the Rebbe writes to someone asking regarding the truth of the story of Mount Sinai.
Text 9.
Text 9.
The divine revelation of Mount Sinai was a fact witnessed by millions of people all of whom reported it to its minutest detail accurately, for the whole people of Israel stood at Mount Sinai and witnessed it. We know that this is a fact because millions of Jews in our day accept it as such, because they received it as such from their own parents, and these millions in turn received the evidence from the previous generation and so on, in an uninterrupted chain of transmitted evidence from millions to millions of witnesses, generation after generation, back to the original millions of witnesses who saw the event with their own eyes. Among these original witnesses, there were many who were initiated in the sciences of those days, many achievements of which are still baffling nowadays. Among them were phenomena connected with it without contradiction to one another. Such a fact is certainly indisputable. I do not believe that there is another fact which can match it for evidence and accuracy. To deny such a fact is anything but scientific. It is the very opposite of science. Parenthetically, it is unfortunate that this basic difference between the Jewish religion and those of others is so little known, for the Jewish religion is the only one that is not based on a single founder or a few, but is based on the divine revelation witnessed by all the people, numbering several millions. This answers also
Anonymous
also,
statement.
yes, this answers also statement that the acceptance of the Torah as being the only truth is dangerous, since its authors were only men, and as men they could not have been infallible. Jews accept the Torah precisely because it was given by God, not man, and it was given in the presence of millions of people who had seen it and heard it with their own ears, with their own eyes and ears. This is why the Torah is the absolute truth, for God is absolute.
You're off.
Okay, and with that, we are
Oh,
going to
oh.
finish with the key points video. Enjoy.
Lesson 6. 1. For thousands of years, our people have believed that God revealed himself to our ancestors and addressed them at Mount Sinai. 2. It is unlikely that someone could falsely convince an entire nation that they themselves experienced a divine revelation. 3. It is unlikely that someone could falsely persuade an entire nation that all their ancestors experienced a divine revelation. The listeners would have refused to accept this, asserting that if it were true, they certainly would have heard of this from their parents. 4. If someone single-handedly reminded the Jewish people of the Sinai event, this person would be duly recognized in the record of Jewish history. 5. The fact that no other religious group lays claim to a mass revelation highlights the uniqueness of the Jewish faith. 6. It is unlikely that the Sinai narrative began as a story of a revelation to a few that snowballed into a story of mass revelation. If this were a possibility, it would have been replicated by others.
Okay. And with that, we finished the course of Judaism Decoded. Thank you for joining me. And I will be sending out an email with the link to this lesson along with the other lessons, as well as the link to that video that I showed you a clip from, where I think he does a great job in bringing out these points very, very eloquently, as well as joking about, how well would it go down, whether it was Fred or Moses, telling us that God told all the men to take a knife and to cut themselves and to not work on the seventh year, and many other ridiculous things that the Jewish people because we believe to have seen God. Okay.
I
Thank
just want to say
you.
something. First of all, I loved Fred because it's not like Murray. Like it's like Fred. None of us have a Fred. I also want to say for 1 second, since we're on Zoom, if you go to the button on the bottom that says react, can you put in a reaction for Rabbi Levy? Can we like put something in?
Wait, where is the, oh,
If you go hit react, what did you think of this course? How was it for you?
Hit react, wait a minute.
Where does it say? Where does it-
Yeah. Well, if you go down the bottom, it says react, put in your reaction to this course.
Oh,
Oh, wait,
oh,
Yeah.
there,
You could others. You could do one after the other and
the
have
hearts. Oh,
layer on more. Go to the next one, have more reactions.
where is he? I didn't find it. I don't
The
know.
there's
Where
the heart. The heart icon near chat, Linda.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I have to go.
Yeah, and the Zoom thing next to chat, it has a heart. It says react.
I don't have it.
Oh, it's on your iPad.
I have my
iPad. Yeah, it's somewhere where the controls are. and
Yeah,
it's before react.
participant. Wait a minute. Let me. Oh, here they are. I
Yeah,
got
come
it.
on, give us what you got. What do you think?
Okay,
Come on.
okay. Thumbs
You need to
up.
tell us.
Wait a minute.
Thumbs
Hold on.
up. Come on, get some sparkles, something.
Hold on. Wait a minute. We'll get sparkle. Wait.
I got a
Share.
rocket ship, Levy. My rocket ship.
Participants.
Love
Bye.
it. Okay.
Thank you. It was
Thank you for
wonderful.
joining us.
I think we've all had a
you.
great
Yes.
experience again. Thank you, Levy. I just want
Oh,
to thank everyone, celebrate you. Thank you.
I think we were notch higher. I can't find an Israel flag.
No,
oh,
on the
Oh,
screen.
Oh,